stage Professor Ian Ramsey, who is going to be launching the Australian Asset Owner Stewardship Code. Professor Ramsey is the Harold Ford Professor of Commercial Law at the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. He's also a Director of the Centre for Corporate Law and Securities Regulation at the University. I'm sure he's very well known to all of you. Please welcome Professor Ramsey.
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be invited to launch the Australian Asset Owner Stewardship Code. And let me say it's very appropriate that it's being launched at the ACSI annual conference, because the Stewardship Code was developed by ACSI in consultation with its members and other stakeholders. Stewardship codes aim to produce more responsible and purposeful investor engagement with investee companies, with the objective of promoting sustainable value creation by companies. The Australian Code defines stewardship as the responsibility asset owners have to exercise their ownership rights to protect and enhance long-term investment value for their beneficiaries by promoting sustainable value creation in the companies in which they invest. And stewardship activities include monitoring and engaging with companies on matters such as strategy, performance, risk, capital structure and corporate governance, and can include engagement on issues such as climate change, labour and human rights, diversity issues on the board, and executive remuneration. Australia already has a stewardship code that applies to fund managers, but the stewardship code being launched today is the first Australian code that concerns the stewardship activities of asset owners. And the code will assist asset owners embed stewardship into their policies, practices and disclosures if they have not already done so, and thereby set the standard for stewardship practices in Australia. ACSI is uniquely placed to develop, monitor and review the operation of Australia's first stewardship code for asset owners. ACSI has been promoting good stewardship practices for many years, including through producing governance guidelines, proxy voting services, and a collective engagement model. ACSI also actively contributes to government, parliamentary committees, and other relevant public policy forums to promote a regulatory system that is equitable and effective for long-term investors. Put simply, ACSI is a leader in governance debates. It's important to place the Australian Asset Ownership Code in an international context in two ways. First, the international evidence on the impact of institutional investors on corporate governance, and second, the international trend to introduce stewardship codes. Turning to the first of these, one reason stewardship codes are important is because of the research that has demonstrated how institutional investors have a powerful and positive influence on improving corporate governance. For example, in a paper titled, "Does Governance Travel Around the World? Evidence from Institutional Investors," published in the Journal of Financial Economics, the authors examined whether institutional investors affect corporate governance by analysing portfolio holdings of institutions in more than 2,000 companies from 23 countries. They find that institutional investors, when they invest internationally, export good corporate governance practices around the world. And the authors state that their research establishes a direct link between international portfolio investment by institutional investors and the adoption of better corporate governance practices that promote corporate accountability and decision-making. Their findings support the view that institutions are not simply attracted to companies with stronger governance, but they also play a direct role in improving governance. And in a more recent paper to be published later this year, entitled "Do Institutional Investors Drive Corporate Social Responsibility? International Evidence," the authors examine institutional investment in 3,300 companies in 41 countries over a 10-year period. And they find that institutional investment is positively correlated with enhanced environmental and social performance of companies. And this relationship is causal. In other words, institutional investors push for better environmental and social performance. So given this evidence on the positive role of institutional investors, stewardship codes, with their aim of producing more responsible and purposeful investor engagement with investee companies, are to be encouraged. The second aspect of the international context is that stewardship codes have been introduced in an increasing number of countries as a means of providing a framework for the way in which institutional investors engage with companies. The UK Stewardship Code, published by the Financial Reporting Council, was introduced in 2010 and updated in 2012. Almost 20 countries now have stewardship codes. Most have been developed at the industry level, but in some countries, these codes have been introduced by regulators to complement existing governance codes. But stewardship codes are very distinct from governance codes, as they are specifically directed at creating more responsible and purposeful investor engagement. Stewardship codes have some common features. First, they're generally what we refer to as soft law rather than legislation. This allows them to be more dynamic and to be more easily updated to reflect current practice. Second, they typically consist of a set of principles accompanied by guidance or recommendations. Again, this provides for flexibility and for investors to adapt their stewardship approach to their circumstances, size, resources, membership, and investment policies. Third, they allow investors to choose whether or not to become signatories, and they operate on a comply or explain basis through public disclosure on their websites. Fourth, they commonly focus on monitoring and engagement, voting policy, collective action, and disclosure of stewardship activities. The codes encourage signatories to create policies on these kinds of issues and to publicly disclose those policies. The Australian Code being launched today reflects these features, which are common to stewardship codes. It contains 6 principles. 1, asset owners should publicly disclose how they approach their stewardship responsibilities. 2, asset owners should publicly disclose their policy for voting at company meetings and voting activity. 3, asset owners should engage with companies, either directly or indirectly or both. 4, asset owners should monitor asset managers' stewardship activities. 5, asset owners should encourage better alignment of the operation of the financial system and regulatory policy with the interests of long-term investors. 6, asset owners should report to beneficiaries about their stewardship activities. These 6 principles in the Australian Code are each accompanied by guidance, typically by way of examples, to assist owners implement the principles. It's stated in the Code that the way the principles are implemented will differ depending upon the asset owner's circumstances, including size, resourcing, and investment policies. The Code is directed at Australian asset owners who have equity holdings in Australian listed companies. And like the UK Stewardship Code, it applies on a comply or explain basis. That is, it's voluntary, but signatories to the Code must publish a statement on their website to explain how each of the 6 principles is applied and, if relevant, explain why the asset owner has chosen not to comply with a particular principle or principles. Are stewardship codes effective? Well, as these codes are a relatively recent development, there's little research on what they've achieved so far, but the experience in the UK is important. Every year since 2011, the UK Financial Reporting Council, or FRC, has published an annual report on the implementation of both the UK Corporate Governance Code and Stewardship Code. In its most recent annual report, the FRC highlights that stewardship statements by signatories, evidence from surveys conducted by the FRC and discussions with market participants suggest that the quality and the quantity of stewardship activities has improved in the UK since the Code was introduced in 2010. The FRC has been concerned by some reporting on steward activities that was inadequate, but the FRC has worked with signatories and that has clearly led to improved reporting. The FRC has observed, and let me quote, some investors are now going beyond simply describing their policies and processes and have begun to report on the outcomes of specific cases of individual and collective engagement. This is to be welcomed, says the FRC, as it helps to demonstrate that there is substance behind public statements. Given the experience of the FRC with the UK Stewardship Code, I suggest there's a very important role for ACSI in not only working with asset owners to improve their stewardship activities, but in assessing the stewardship statements of asset owners to identify what is good disclosure and what disclosures can be improved. To conclude, the Australian Asset Owner Stewardship Code will help strengthen the current stewardship culture that ACSI has already been creating in Australia through guidelines and engagement activities. It will complement initiatives that are focused on responsible investment and enhancing corporate social responsibility. I congratulate ACSI and its members on this very important initiative. Thank you.